The evening was supposed to be uneventful. A simple dinner with Sophia bringing her new boyfriend to meet us. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary, as Sophia's boyfriends always seemed like a parade of the same type. Polite, charming, but ultimately forgettable. When Dylan walked in, though, my expectations shattered instantly. He was striking, a young man with golden blonde hair, smooth skin that seemed to glow under the dim dining room light, and a physique that spoke of discipline and youth. I found myself staring longer than I should, my mind racing with thoughts I hadn't felt in years. I forced myself to focus on small talk, masking the inexplicable attraction I felt. My wife, unaware of the storm brewing inside me, chatted away with Dylan about his studies and hobbies. Sophia, as usual, beamed with pride as she introduced him, her confidence in her choice evident. But all I could think about was how this boy, barely 19, stirred something deep within me, something forbidden. The dinner progressed slowly, each passing moment heightening my awareness of his presence. His laugh, casual yet magnetic, echoed in my ears. The way he carried himself, confident but not arrogant, made it impossible for me to ignore him. I caught myself glancing at him more times than I could count, hoping my wife and daughter wouldn't notice. When Sophia excused herself to answer a call, I found myself alone with Dylan for the first time. The silence between us felt loaded, as if the room itself could sense the tension. "So, Dylan," I said, my voice steady but my heart pounding, "what are your intentions with my daughter?" It was a question meant to deflect my own guilt, but his nervous smile only deepened my intrigue. He hesitated, running a hand through his golden hair. "I just want to make her happy, sir," he replied, his voice soft and sincere. The way he looked at me, a mix of respect and curiosity, only made it harder for me to maintain my composure. As the night came to an end, I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning. The pull I felt toward Dylan wasn't something I could ignore or dismiss. It was dangerous, wrong, and yet utterly intoxicating. That night, as I lay beside my wife, my thoughts were consumed by him. The way he moved, the sound of his voice, the energy he carried. It was unlike anything I had felt before. I knew I was treading on dangerous ground, but the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. The next day, I couldn't shake the image of Dylan from my mind. It was more than his looks. It was the way he carried himself, the easy confidence in his voice, the way his smile lingered just enough to make me wonder if he knew the effect he had. As I sipped my morning coffee, Sophia bounded into the kitchen, her voice bright as she announced her plans to spend the day shopping with her mother. My heart skipped a beat. This was my chance. "Why don't you let Dylan stay behind?" I suggested casually, trying to mask the anticipation in my voice. "I'd like to get to know him better, one-on-one." Sophia raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "Really, Dad? You're usually indifferent to my boyfriends," she teased, but eventually agreed. Dylan, to my relief, didn't object. When they left, the house seemed quieter than usual, the absence of my wife and daughter amplifying the tension that hung in the air. Dylan sat across from me in the living room, sipping a beer I'd offered him. His casual demeanor only heightened my awareness of him, the way his fingers wrapped around the glass, the faint blush on his cheeks as the alcohol took effect. "So, Dylan," I began, leaning forward slightly, "tell me about yourself. What are your dreams? Your goals?" It was a question I barely cared about, but I needed to hear his voice to see how he'd respond. He smiled, setting his beer down and launched into a story about his aspirations to study architecture. I tried to focus on his words, but my gaze kept drifting to his lips, the curve of his jaw, the way his shirt clung to his chest. Every detail about him seemed to draw me in deeper. As the conversation flowed, I could feel the dynamic between us shifting. His initial nervousness had melted away, replaced by a relaxed confidence that only made him more magnetic. I reached out, almost without thinking, and rested my hand on his knee. It was a subtle gesture, but enough to make him pause mid-sentence. His eyes met mine, wide and uncertain, but he didn't pull away. "Dylan," I said quietly, my voice low and deliberate, "you're an incredible young man. I hope you know that." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he tried to process my words. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. But I could see it in his eyes. Confusion, curiosity, and something else. Something that mirrored the fire burning inside me. The tension between us was palpable, the air thick with unspoken desire. I leaned in, my hand sliding slightly higher on his thigh. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable," I said softly, "but there's something about you. I can't explain it." The moment hung between us, heavy and electric, until he finally spoke. This is crazy," he murmured, his voice trembling but not retreating. "You're Sophia's dad." The words should have been a wake-up call, a reminder of the lines we were about to cross. But instead, they only fueled my determination. "It's our secret," I whispered, my lips barely inches from his. And then, before he could respond, I closed the distance between us, capturing his lips in a kiss that felt both forbidden and inevitable. For a brief moment, he froze, but then he kissed me back, his hesitance melting away as the passion between us ignited. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely intoxicating. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our faces flushed with the gravity of what had just happened. "This stays between us," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me that this was far from over. The hours after Dylan left felt surreal. My wife and Sophia returned from their shopping trip, blissfully unaware of the firestorm that had ignited in their absence. I smiled, played the role of the loving husband and father, but inside, my thoughts were consumed by what had happened. The kiss wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the start of something far more dangerous. Dylan's face, his touch, his whispered, "This is crazy," echoed in my mind, each memory pulling me deeper into an obsession I couldn't control. Sophia chattered on about her day, oblivious to the tension brewing beneath my calm exterior. I stole glances at her, guilt briefly surfacing as I remembered the line I had crossed. But that guilt was quickly overshadowed by the thrill of it all. The forbidden nature of my desire made it even harder to resist. Dylan's lingering scent on the couch cushions where he had sat taunted me, reminding me of how close we had been, and how much closer I wanted to be. That night, I lay in bed beside my wife, staring at the ceiling as the weight of my actions settled in. My heart raced as I replayed the kiss over and over, the way his lips had hesitated before giving in, the way his breath had quickened against mine. I knew I should feel ashamed, but instead, all I felt was a desperate longing to see him again. I wanted more, needed more, and I was willing to take risks to get it. The next morning, Sophia announced that Dylan would be joining us for dinner again later that week. My pulse quickened at the thought, but I kept my face neutral, nodding casually as if the news didn't send my heart into overdrive. "That's great," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "He seems like a nice guy." Sophia smiled, oblivious, and returned to texting on her phone. The days leading up to his visit were a blur. I found myself obsessing over every detail. What I'd wear, what I'd say, how I'd create another opportunity to be alone with him. It was reckless and selfish, but the thought of him was intoxicating, clouding my judgment. I justified my actions by telling myself it was just a harmless attraction, that nothing else would happen. But deep down, I knew better. The connection we had felt in that kiss wasn't something I could simply ignore. When Dylan arrived that evening, my heart raced the moment I saw him. He looked effortlessly handsome in a fitted shirt and jeans, his blonde hair tousled as if he had just stepped out of a magazine. He greeted Sophia with a kiss on the cheek, but his eyes flickered toward me for just a second, enough to send a jolt of electricity through my veins. I felt a pang of jealousy watching him with her, but I quickly buried it, focusing instead on the possibilities the night might bring. As the evening progressed, I found subtle ways to interact with him, brushing against him as I passed by, catching his gaze during conversations. Each moment felt charged, a silent acknowledgement of what we had shared. By the time dinner was over, the tension between us was nearly unbearable. My wife and Sophia, once again oblivious, excused themselves to clean up, leaving Dylan and me alone in the living room. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I knew this was my chance. The silence in the living room was deafening as Dylan and I found ourselves alone again. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his body language a mix of tension and uncertainty. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his gaze darted between the doorway where Sophia had disappeared and the spot where I stood. It was clear that he was battling his emotions just as much as I was. But beneath the hesitation, there was something else, a flicker of desire that matched my own. I grabbed 2 beers from the fridge and handed one to him, hoping to ease the tension. He accepted it with a faint smile, his fingers brushing against mine for a brief moment. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I knew I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. "You seem nervous," I said softly, taking a seat beside him. My voice was calm, but my heart was pounding, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered, staring down at the bottle in his hands. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but the words hung heavy in the air. "What happened before? It was a mistake." There was a pause, his chest rising and falling as he took a deep breath. "I don't even know why I let it happen." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees as I studied him. "Because it felt right," I said simply, my tone steady but deliberate. "You can't tell me you didn't feel it too." The tension between us was palpable, the room shrinking around us as the unspoken truth lingered in the space between. He didn't respond, but the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes avoided mine, told me everything I needed to know. Without thinking, I reached out, placing a hand gently on his thigh. He stiffened at first, his breath hitching, but he didn't pull away. "Dylan," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about you. And I don't think you can either." My fingers tightened slightly, my touch both a question and an invitation. His eyes finally met mine, wide and conflicted, but there was no mistaking the fire that burned behind them. "This is insane," he said, his voice shaking. But even as the words left his lips, he leaned closer, his resolve crumbling under the weight of his emotions. Our faces were mere inches apart, the tension between us electric. "What if someone finds out?" he added, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and anticipation. "What if Sophia finds out?" "She won't," I assured him, my voice firm and unwavering. "This stays between us. No one ever has to know." The words were a promise, but also a temptation, a final push toward the edge. And then, before he could protest further, I closed the distance between us, my lips capturing his in a kiss that was both urgent and tender. This time, there was no hesitation. He kissed me back with a fervor that matched my own, his hands gripping my shoulders as if anchoring himself to me. The world outside melted away, leaving only the two of us and the unrelenting passion that had been building between us. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our faces flushed with the intensity of the moment. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice barely audible, but even as he spoke, his fingers lingered on my arm, betraying his words. "You don't have to decide anything right now," I replied, my voice calm but insistent. "Just think about it." He nodded slowly, his expression a mix of confusion and longing. As he stood to leave, I watched him go, knowing that this was far from over. The spark between us had been rekindled, and there was no extinguishing it now. The days after that night were a blur of conflicting emotions. Dylan's kiss lingered in my mind like a brand, searing into my thoughts no matter how much I tried to push it away. Every time I saw Sophia or my wife, guilt would creep in, but it was always drowned out by the overwhelming pull I felt toward him. I told myself it was just an infatuation, something fleeting that I could control. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't going away. Dylan hadn't been around since that night, and his absence was suffocating. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, hoping for a message, a sign that he was thinking about me too. When Sophia mentioned casually that he was busy with school, I forced a neutral smile, pretending it didn't bother me. But inside, jealousy gnawed at me, an irrational fear that he was avoiding me, or worse, regretting everything that had happened between us. Finally, late one evening, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Dylan, simple but loaded with meaning. "I can't stop thinking about you." My heart raced as I stared at the screen, a rush of adrenaline coursing through me. He hadn't forgotten. Whatever this was, it wasn't one-sided. I quickly typed out a response, my fingers trembling slightly. "I feel the same. Can we talk?" The next day, Sophia invited Dylan over for dinner. Again. My pulse quickened when she told me, the anticipation nearly unbearable. I spent the entire day trying to act normal, but by the time the evening rolled around, I could barely contain my excitement. When Dylan walked through the door, our eyes met briefly, and it was like the rest of the room disappeared. He looked as conflicted as I felt, but there was no mistaking the flicker of recognition in his gaze. Throughout dinner, the tension was palpable. Every glance, every accidental brush of our hands sent a jolt through me. My wife and Sophia chatted away, oblivious to the charged atmosphere. I could tell Dylan was struggling to keep his composure, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that only made him more endearing. I wanted to reach out to reassure him, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. After dinner, Sophia suggested a movie night, but I saw my opportunity. "Why don't you two go ahead?" I said, feigning fatigue. "I'll clean up." Sophia, eager to spend time with Dylan, didn't hesitate. As they disappeared into the living room, I watched them go, the pang of jealousy sharp and unrelenting. But I reminded myself that this was temporary. Sophia couldn't keep him from me forever. Later that night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Dylan slipped out of the house quietly. My phone buzzed moments later. "Can we meet?" The message was brief, but the meaning was clear. My heart pounded as I replied, suggesting a nearby park. It was risky, but the thought of being alone with him again was too enticing to resist. When I arrived, he was already there, pacing nervously under the dim glow of a street lamp. The sight of him took my breath away. "I can't keep doing this," he said the moment he saw me. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "It's not fair to Sophia, or to you." I stepped closer, my heart aching at the distance he was trying to create. "Dylan," I said softly, "nothing about this is fair. But I can't walk away. Not now." He hesitated, his hands clenched at his sides, before finally looking at me. "Neither can I," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The tension in the park was suffocating as Dylan and I stood under the pale glow of the street lamp. His confession lingered in the air, and for a moment, neither of us dared to speak. The stillness of the night only amplified the weight of his words. "Neither can I," he had said. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever this was between us, it had taken root, and trying to ignore it would be futile. I reached out, my hand brushing against his arm, and he didn't pull away. "Dylan," I began, my voice calm but deliberate. "We can figure this out. No one has to know." The suggestion was reckless, but the fire in his eyes told me he was considering it. He sighed, running a hand through his blonde hair, his hesitation palpable. "This feels wrong," he murmured, his voice low. "But at the same time, it feels like the only thing that makes sense." I stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "It's not wrong if it's real," I said softly, my tone unwavering. "And this is real." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing, and I knew I had struck a chord. The pull between us was undeniable, and for the first time, he seemed to stop fighting it. Without another word, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It was as if he was trying to erase his doubts, to lose himself in the moment. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer, the rest of the world fading away. For those few minutes, nothing else mattered. Not Sophia, not the risks, not the consequences. It was just us. When we finally pulled apart, he looked at me, his breathing uneven. "What are we doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. I searched his face, trying to find the right words to calm his storm. "We're following our hearts," I said simply. It sounded cliché, even to me, but it was the truth. The connection between us was too powerful to ignore, no matter how complicated it might be. As we parted ways that night, a sense of both exhilaration and dread settled over me. The thrill of our stolen moments was intoxicating, but the reality of our situation loomed like a dark cloud. How long could we keep this a secret? How long before Sophia or my wife noticed the cracks in my carefully constructed facade? The answers eluded me, but one thing was clear. I wasn't ready to let Dylan go. The following days were a delicate balancing act. Every interaction with Sophia felt like walking a tightrope, my guilt threatening to topple me at any moment. Dylan, too, seemed to struggle with the weight of our secret. When he came over for dinner again, The tension was almost unbearable. Every glance, every accidental touch felt charged, as if we were on the brink of being discovered. And then it happened. A slip, a moment too intimate, and Sophia's sharp eyes caught it. "What was that?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. My heart stopped, and I quickly covered, laughing it off as a misunderstanding. "Nothing," I said, waving it away. "Just talking about football." She didn't look convinced, but thankfully, she didn't press further. Dylan avoided my gaze for the rest of the evening, clearly rattled. I knew we were playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were getting higher with every passing day. Sophia's voice cut through the room. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her eyes darting between Dylan and me. Dylan froze, unable to speak, and I struggled to find an excuse. "Nothing, Sophia. We were just talking," I said, but my words sounded hollow. "Talking?" she snapped, her voice rising. "I'm not blind, Dad. What's really going on?" Dylan tried to apologize, but Sophia's fury drowned him out. "You've been sneaking around, haven't you?" Her voice cracked, and the weight of her realization crushed the room into silence. Before I could respond, she stormed out, her final words stinging like a slap. "You're both disgusting." The house was silent without Sophia. Dylan sat across from me, his head in his hands. "I should go," he said quietly. His guilt was palpable, but I couldn't let him take all the blame. "It's not just on you," I said. "We made these choices together." Dylan shook his head, his voice trembling. "She'll never forgive us. How can we move on from this?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that staying here, surrounded by our mistakes, wasn't an option anymore. The decision was clear. I had to leave. I called Dylan and told him my plan. "Let's start over somewhere new," I said. He hesitated but agreed. "I'm with you," he replied. I left a letter for my wife explaining my truth and apologizing. Dylan and I packed and drove away that night, leaving behind the wreckage of our old lives. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was ours. We settled in a small town, far from everything we knew. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Dylan became my partner, and for the first time, I felt free. Hey, what did you think of today's real story? A hot and intriguing tale sent in by one of our bold followers. Did you know that your story could also become a video? That's right. Send us your best story, and who knows, it might be featured here. Now, we'd love to hear from you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with today's story? Drop your rating in the comments and let us know your thoughts. I'm eagerly waiting to read what you have to say. See you in the next video here on our channel. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of these incredible stories. See you soon.